Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. What inspired Edgar Allan Poe's gruesome tales of grisly murders and horrible crimes? We'll find out in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Long before podcasts and Dateline NBC, the public craved the latest, most sensational stories of true crime. And they often found their fix in the newspapers of the day. But if that weren't enough, they could get the Tragic Almanac. This is a yearly roundup of all the most gruesome and horrible crimes and tragedies. And this happens to be the one for 1843, which would have come out in late 1842, and it details the preceding year's crimes alongside the lunar calendar, the best times to plant your crops. Oh, and here's the murder of Mr. Ewing by Miss Hamlet. There's also steamboat explosions and fires, but the cover image shows the murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers from 1841. She was known as the beautiful cigar girl because she worked in the cigar store, Anderson's Cigar Emporium to be precise. And this was at a time when not a lot of women were working out in public. And here she was, this beautiful young woman. Before you know it, half the men in New York City were flocking to Anderson's Cigar Emporium. And particular writers, one of them said that he spent an entire afternoon exchanging flirtatious glances with her. Then, in July 1841, she said she went uptown to visit some relatives. She disappeared for 3 days. People had no idea what happened to her. It made the newspapers. People searched the city, couldn't find her. Then she turned up floating offshore off of Hoboken, New Jersey, just across the river. The New York police said, this is a New Jersey problem, you found it here. The New Jersey police said, oh, she floated down from New York, so she's your problem. Meanwhile, the body was just lying on the beach, decaying before the coroner came and performed an autopsy of what was left and found out she'd been strangled. The body appeared to have been dragged some distance and dumped into the river, where it was found by a couple boys in a rowboat. Just happened to be having a nice summer afternoon. And theories abound as to what happened. So naturally, the constables at the time, the NYPD hadn't been founded yet. That would be founded in 1845. So the constables interrogated everybody she known, including her fiance. Nobody confessed, so they said it must have been a gang of hoodlums. And that's who's killed her, one of the gangs of New York, apparently, and they're wearing their little top hats. But Poe doubted that theory. He said, this is a personal crime. She was murdered by an individual, somebody she knew well, not just a random gang with no motive. So Poe set out to compile all the newspapers he could find and study the case, and that proved the inspiration for his short story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. And to clear up any doubt, he actually wrote at the beginning of the story, this is based on the Mary Rogers case. I know what I'm doing. It's the longest short story he ever wrote that could still classify as a short story. It was spread out over 3 installments of the magazine, and it was still an active case while Poe was publishing his installments. So before he published the final installment, a nearby roadhouse where Mary Rogers was last seen alive, the owner of that roadhouse, she died. One of her sons said he accidentally shot her and she was on her deathbed, and the story goes she confessed that Mary Rogers had died under her roof during an illegal medical procedure. And that meant Poe would have to change his story. Later it's found out that there's no actual official document verifying that this whole incident ever happened, that she never gave her deathbed confession to any authorities or anybody who would actually write it down. So this was just a rumor that Mary Rogers had died as a result of this accidental medical procedure, because after all, the body did show that she had been strangled. But Poe felt he needed to change the ending of the story, so he rewrote the last installment. But then right when you get to the very end of the story, there's a note from the editor that says we can't publish the name of the killer because we don't be sued for libel. I'm pretty sure Poe wrote that note himself so he could always claim he'd solved the mystery without actually having to solve the mystery. And people in his time believed he solved it, so it must have worked. But Poe even went so far as to say there was a certain naval officer, and even to give one of his fiancées the name of that naval officer he thought murdered Mary Rogers. Another one of the cases that's covered in here, it's a great one back here. This is John C. Colt. He's the brother of Samuel Colt, the rifle manufacturer. And here he is murdering Samuel Adams, not the beer guy, another Samuel Adams, and not using a rifle, but a hatchet. The problem is he did this right on Broadway, in his office in broad daylight. Now he's got a corpse to get rid of. You can't just take it outside. It's too busy out there. What are you going to do? He decided, why don't I chop it into little pieces, put it in a crate, and mail that thing to New Orleans? And sure enough, they picked up the box, they shipped it to New Orleans, but people started to miss Samuel Adams and asked, where did he go? Eventually, they convinced John Colt to confess that, yeah, I shipped it to New Orleans, and the authorities tracked down the crate, and they asked the sailors in the boat, didn't you smell the decaying corpse here? And they said, we just thought it was rat poison. So Colt got in trouble for that. And we think this story might have inspired Poe's story about a man who was carrying very special cargo in an oblong box. Actually, we got a movie poster for it back there, The Oblong Box. Spoiler alert, there's a body in there. So that shows you that people in Poe's time were interested in true crime. We've got another piece of memorabilia here. This is from 1851, so it's just after Poe's death, but it's a confession of the awful and bloody transactions in the life of Charles Wallace, fiend-like murderer of Miss Mary Rogers. So this claims to be the confession of her murderer. And as you can see on the back, there's a single person committing the murder, so Poe would have liked that. But this goes on to detail how Charles Wallace not only did murder Mary Cecilia Rogers here, but also went on a kind of a killing spree. And finally, he was captured, and they burned him at the stake. But while he's burning up, he confessed his crimes to a priest, and that's the contents of this booklet. If that sounds a little bit unbelievable to you, it's because it is. This is just a hoax. They were committing hoaxes like this even back then. So I think a lot of what inspired Poe to write these stories was the audience's craving for this kind of thing. And we can just look through contemporary letters in our museum collection and find different references to the top murders of the time. This is a piece of what today we would call murderabilia. This came from the album of Lucy Dorothea Henry, who was Patrick Henry's granddaughter. Patrick Henry's the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death guy. And she specialized in the 1840s, 1850s in collecting celebrity autographs and letters and manuscripts. These are usually famous writers like Poe or Nathaniel Hawthorne or Henry Wadsworth Longfellow or Charles Dickens, or they're politicians. She got pretty much every president of the United States from the first John Adams up to Franklin Pierce in her album. But this is a piece of murderabilia. In fact, she writes right at the bottom of the letter, this is by Professor Webster of Boston, hung for the murder of Parkman. So what's that all about? Professor Webster was a professor of chemistry at Harvard Medical College, and he never was so great with his money. He'd already lost his family house, he was falling on hard times, so he decided to borrow some money from a very wealthy local Bostoner named Parkman. George Parkman was well known around Boston. He was super rich, but super cheap, and he refused to get a horse, so he just walked all over town. Everybody knew him. John White Webster, he was not the most popular professor. They thought he was extraordinarily boring, and people just didn't seem to like him that much. But in November of 1849, so about a month after Poe died, Webster just couldn't pay off his debts, so he decided to invite Parkman over to Harvard and discuss the matter with him. And when Parkman got there, Webster murdered him. Once again, what do you do with the body? Well, of course, he chopped into pieces. He had the idea apparently of throwing some acid on it. Maybe he could dissolve it in acid. There was remnants of acid on some of his clothing. That didn't quite work. So he threw the rest of the body parts in a furnace and tried to just incinerate them, which is harder than you would think. There were leftover pieces or bones and things. And since Parkman was so well known to walk around Boston, people immediately missed him. They said, "Where'd Parkman go?" And the last place he was seen alive was when he entered Harvard. And they traced him back to Webster. And fortunately, there was a janitor there who remembered that Webster was burning something. So they broke into the furnace and found bones. At that point, this is 1849. They can't really identify a body just based on bones. They don't have DNA testing or anything like that. But fortunately, there was a dental appliance on the jawbone, maybe a bridge. And they took it to the local dentist. The dentist said, "Yeah, that's my work. That came from Parkman's mouth." So Webster was one of the first people in the United States convicted based on forensic evidence, in fact, on dental evidence. So, of course, this made the papers back then, and that inspired Lucy Henry here to collect one of his letters, just as a piece of murderabilia, as they call it today. And in 1867, when Charles Dickens came to the United States, he was touring Boston, and he said one of the things he absolutely wanted to see was the room in which Webster killed Parkman. But you'd be surprised how many letters in the collection there are where people mention the famous murder trials today. This is a letter from Octavia Griswold. It's part of our Griswold family collection. Rufus Griswold was Poe's worst enemy and first biographer. And here, his relative Octavia is writing about a recent murder. Just casually drops this into one of her letters. What a shocking affair that Burdell murder was. I guess Miss Cunningham and Eckel will be acquitted whether guilty or not. Does it not seem strange that human nature, female too, can become so depraved? If this were the first offense, but one who could concoct such a bold work is no tyro in wickedness. Yeah, tyro is not really a word that's used that much anymore, but it means novice. So this isn't her first rodeo. Octavia is saying she must have done this before if she's that good at murdering somebody. But was she? Was Mrs. Cunningham really that good at murder? So here's what happened. Miss Cunningham was Emma Cunningham, who was a widow living in New York City, and she was a tenant. She lived in a room she rented from a Dr. Harvey Burdell, who was a very rich dentist. In fact, he rented other rooms out. There's a fellow named Eckel who lived in one of the other rooms. And then on January 31st, 1857, Burdell's servants found him in his office, his home office. He actually had a dental office at home. And he was covered in blood. He'd been strangled and he'd been stabbed at least a dozen times by a left-handed person. And guess who was left-handed? Who lived in that house? Emma Cunningham. So immediately she was a suspect. And Eckel was considered to be her accomplice. Like he's the one who was strangling Burdell while she stabbed him to death. I don't know how they thought they were going to get away with this. So she was put on trial. It was a sensational trial. And at the funeral, she apparently threw herself on Burdell's coffin, said how much she loved him. And she revealed to everyone that she had secretly married him. So she should inherit his huge fortune. She didn't realize this probably made her look guilty because it gave her a motive. But for whatever reason, the jury found her not guilty. So she's about to inherit the fortune, right? Wrong. Although she claims that she got married before a minister, they'd never actually filed the paperwork with anyone, so she wasn't technically married to Dr. Burdell. But she's not going to give up yet. She bought a baby. She actually paid $1,000 for a baby, which she said was Burdell's baby. She said, oh, I've been pregnant this whole time. You just didn't notice. And here's Burdell's baby. So the baby is now Burdell's heir, and that means his mother gets all the money. The problem is she immediately got caught and thrown in jail. She was released a couple months later for lack of evidence, and she eventually left New York City. She came back shortly before her death. I think she was 67 years old when she died. And she didn't inherit any of this money. The whole scheme didn't work out. She killed him. She bought a baby, all that for nothing. Allegedly killed him and bought a baby for nothing. And it at the time was one of the biggest cases out there. And this is what fascinated the public. I mean, on both sides of the Atlantic. So those are just a few of the true crime cases to be found among the files here at the Poe Museum. You can turn up on the letters and newspapers and magazines today. But these are some of the more sensational ones. So we get back to the question with which we began this video. What inspired Poe to write about these crimes? These horrific murders that you find in The Telltale Heart or The Black Cat, The Mystery of Marie Roget, The Imp of the Perverse? Well, he didn't have to look much farther than the newspapers, to the world around him. And why did he write these? Was he fascinated with crime? Or did he just know his public and know that his audience craved these sort of things? In fact, Poe was a magazinist. He knew what commanded the headlines. He knew what sold papers. Very early, when he was 26 years old, he wrote to his boss at the Southern Literary Messenger, trying to explain why he'd written Berenice, a story inspired by some Baltimore dental students who'd been caught digging up corpses to steal the teeth. And Poe explained to his boss, this is what the public wants. Trust me, this is going to sell. So what do you think? Was Poe obsessed with murder? Or did he just know his public and what they craved? Let us know down in the comments. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces like A Confession of the Awful and Bloody Transactions of the Life of Charles Wallace, fiend-like murderer of Miss Mary Rogers, why not contribute to the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. But until next time, thanks for joining us, and we'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.